What conditions or stipulations, magic tricks or manipulations, interjecting conversation.
Yeah. Speaking of Pride Month, when I went to go launch the Zoom meeting, Zoom has their logo rainbow. Thank you, Zoom, for saying
Zoom.
gay rights.
All right.
I feel like every company now is like, no. We've always loved gay people.
Are you kidding? We were like the first ones. Front lines, baby.
Zoom through the first brick at Stonewall.
Yeah, right. The first Pride was a Zoom meeting. Yeah, and like the example that you were talking about of like an airline being all Pride-y but then donating, none of these corporations who are all coming out for Pride are doing anything to speak out about the Supreme Court or local, state, federal legislators who, surprisingly enough, even though we've come a long way, there are a lot of them who are anti-gay rights, anti-trans rights, who are still like putting up a fuss about pronouns. And the Supreme Court right now is actually deciding a case about adoption rights for gay couples and whether adoption agencies can claim like religious liberty and deny them. And Brooke, I think we're on the same page in our prediction that that's not going to go too well.
Just looking at the lineup here, you know, Brett Kavanaugh. Thomas has always been
men of the people
for gay rights. I think that they're definitely going to side
Gorsuch too.
Gorsuch surprises me sometimes, but I don't know.
He does, but I feel like not with stuff like this.
Yeah.
When it's religion on the table, because he loves that. And I don't picture him being like a pro-gay. Anyways, this is exceedingly persuasive. I'm Mackenzie Brennan, and this show is pro-gay. And anything,
Rogers, and
what have you in between.
Yeah. Wow, what bravery from us.
You're welcome.
We said
yes. Here's to us.
Being pro-gay, being pro-LGBT community in 2021 feels very much like
very bold.
Kirsten Gillibrand during the Democratic primaries, and she was in that bar and she like took a shot and she's like, gay rights. Thank you very much.
Hey,
I love gays.
I think I'm
like,
always torn about the corporate shit because thank God it's normalized, and I do still have enough, as we'll see in this story, like there's enough in my familial memory that it's like, that's awesome that this is still something that seems controversial in my head, or that other people see it as that, and it's not anymore, at least not on paper, and hey, that's a step.
Well, I think that's kind of like what I was going to say about these businesses who they'll make their logo a rainbow or whatever, and then they'll donate behind the scenes. Their CEO or the company itself is donating to hyper-conservative politicians or causes. It's like they want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to like
their rainbow cake. And
they want, because obviously the end goal is profit, so it's trying to balance. And that's also why I think a lot of companies will like be like, love is love. Thank you for that.
Which is a really statement. Like, again, beats nothing, but it's such a watered down way of
what does it even mean? Like, what are you
support?
saying? Because it's such like a lukewarm. Okay, but it's explicitly what?
I feel like it arose when it was a little controversial to straight up be like, I'm pro-gay. So you would have these like subtle workarounds that you could put on a bumper sticker that weren't expressly like, I love the gays. It's just like,
which is the bumper sticker that's on the back of my Subaru.
Of my ass. No.
I have a tramp stamp. That's what I love the gays. I did actually I was in South Carolina recently, you know, in like Greenville, South Carolina. The hiking granola community is really big. Mm-hmm. And we were in this outdoor supply shop that was really fun. But one of the bumper stickers they had on the door was, I'm pro salmon and I vote.
Okay.
I don't know what it means, but
it's pretty niche. I mean, I guess the only thing I can think is like Alaska environmentalism, because a lot of drilling up there can threaten salmon habitats, but they're far from home if they're in in
But I like
Greenville.
I like the idea of having that as your bumper sticker and then absolutely not explaining it to anyone. Being like,
I
yeah,
own a
that's what it
tuxedo
says.
cat and I vote.
You do. So you should get that as a
So
bumper
don't you
sticker.
forget it.
But no, truly, I think that like the whole trend that of companies, it's like just enough to signal that they are not actively homophobic, while also they never go too far to piss. Like you don't actually hear them being, on the front lines of these are the actual issues that are impacting the LGBT community at this time, and this is how we're addressing them. High suicide rates, lack of
Absolutely.
housing, lack of
Bathroom
health
bills.
care. Yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
They are not doing that.
You're absolutely right that it's enough that they don't piss off the buyers on the other side. It's like,
Exactly.
it's almost this coding that if you're a real fan, you'll get that I'm talking about gays, but not if you're out of the zeitgeist.
Right. And like if you watch a lot of the ads, it'll feature like two conventionally attractive, usually like white people holding hands.
Skinny, classically Western attractive.
Completely like void of, they don't come across as like too much. You know what I mean?
Anything.
Like, yeah, just like
sneaking this in here.
Exactly.
I think we're getting out of that a little bit now, which is good. I think that the generation even younger than us is super good about range of representation.
In 10 years, it'll be totally different.
Yeah, I think that we've moved so fast, so far.
And this episode
is
like that we're about to introduce and reference is such a great representation of how far we've come in the last 30 years or so. And that is something to be applauded. Like the fact that big corporations do feel comfortable, that is technically a net good. I just wish it were a little bit less shady. Like I wish it were a little bit less like obviously just a ploy to pander.
The other pieces that make it so shady weren't there.
Yeah.
I mean, I gotta say, if corporations started pandering by being like, we're pro-choice, abortion should be safe, legal, and accessible, and they were pandering, I'd be like, that's a positive step. So, issues are at different stages, and I feel like that can kind of illustrate how far we've come. And I was actually just talking to my mom about the story in the episode that we're gonna kind of re-air today. And she was talking about how her family, so my grandmother, her son had AIDS, and they used to actually have the gay men's health crisis meetings on the family porch because there were so few places to go.
Mm-hmm.
And kids in the neighborhood, and it was, I mean, this is New York. It was actually a really liberal neighborhood, but kids would ride by on their bikes and throw rocks at the windows.
Yeah.
So, that's less than 40 years ago. And part of the reason that this Pride is such a big one to mark, beyond the fact that we're still in a pandemic, and that's weird. And it was our reason for initially covering the AIDS crisis in parallel to COVID and just government mishandling of diseases. But is that last weekend marked the 40th anniversary of the first diagnoses of AIDS cases and what would eventually be recognized as AIDS. Right. So you think that's 1981.
At the time, the common sentiment was, well, they're bringing some themselves because they're having sex that is like outside of the bounds of what we as like good Christian people deem as appropriate.
Yeah, and I just want to note again, it goes without saying because it's so obvious anytime you hear stories like this, but thinking about 40 years, and I think it's been going around on the internet for a couple years now, but that photo of the original San Francisco Gay Men's Choir, and it has like the original members in white, and then the rest are current members standing in black representing those who died. And it's just like a sea of these black suits and like 4 white suits. And it shows you that this generation, or the generation that grew up in that era, it's a generation without elders. Like it is.
No, absolutely.
And I was even watching, there's a Netflix series on Halston, the designer, and he's another one who died of AIDS. It's like anybody who made a mark in this blip of time in the early to mid 80s, late 80s. Then you got like Freddie Mercury. We were talking about all these people. It's like, oh my God, all these talents that we look to now as icons.
And the people who were left behind are so traumatized by it. Like that generation, from the stories that I have heard, every single member of that generation who was in the LGBT community at the time was affected by this. And so it's like you have this, you're right, this entire generation of who would now have been older gay people who also, it's not just these huge talents that we lost, but it's also we lost so many voices for the LGBT community because they were wiped out by this virus when they were in their 20s.
That's a good point
And
too.
I wonder how much further along we would be if we had not lost so many people.
Like this humanizing force. Yeah. And I think you're so right about the trauma, and maybe this can be our segue into reintroducing the episode. But, you know, I've lost a fair amount of people close to me, and, you know, people cope in different ways, et cetera, et cetera. Trauma's different. But when we spoke to our guest in this episode, I think both of us were struck by how raw it all was for him still. And there are a few things I think that I feel are as unresolved and as gutting a circumstance.
Yeah.
That it just never gets better and it never gets right, as John clearly saw this experience. And I don't think that ever goes away. It's not like you, for me, like reconcile that my dad had an aneurysm that burst, and that's just something that happens to people.
Yeah.
It just doesn't get better.
Experiencing that when you're in such a formative time as your 20s, and it's someone that you were so tied to and in love with,
like your first
so
love,
many people, and
now they're just gone.
The number. I mean, John was, I was so glad that we got the chance to talk to him, and he's one story and your family is one story, but there are so many stories that you dig into. And I would just encourage our listeners to go out and search this Pride Month because of the 40th anniversary, and because it's good to remember that like Pride Month is not just about corporations changing their logos to rainbows or like tweeting out. It's not about that at all.
And it doesn't mean don't celebrate the victories. Like,
have
a great time,
to the march,
enjoy, celebrate yourself. Hell yeah. But I think, it's a great excuse to delve into some of these stories.
It makes the celebration more meaningful when you know the background of the community. And it's
absolutely.
And a lot of young people, thankfully, they might be aware of it, but like thankfully they have not had to experience that trauma as much firsthand. There are still so many stories of like really hard coming out stories, or you know, being rejected by your family members or things like that. But more and more, the younger generation is being more and more accepted by the culture, which is fantastic. But that is a hard fought for a win.
Absolutely. So, and not to get complacent. So this is an episode that we aired about a year ago. The way that we had framed it at the time, which is not irrelevant now, but it was paralleling the Trump administration's handling of COVID with the Reagan administration's handling of HIV/AIDS, and then just delving a little into HIV/AIDS in general as a parallel story. So obviously, don't worry. Anytime that you hear us refer to the Trump administration, like, you weren't dreaming, we are out of it. It's okay. It was a little #triggering for me to listen to it, and the part that I cut out about like how Pence was responsible for an HIV outbreak in Indiana. It's like, and he's now our vice president and he's head of the task force. It's like, oh, that is not true anymore.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I think it's easy because we are under a new administration to feel that way, but also, and I just talked about, you know, how much more accepting the culture is, but there are still these laws like these anti-trans bills that are being passed in conservative states. The Supreme Court case that is being considered about whether or not gay couples can adopt from religious agencies.
Conversion therapy too, I know, is still
so there's still a long way to go, but looking back at this, it's good to remember how far we've come.
We're gonna discuss public health policy, effective and ineffective, when a new pandemic starts spreading. We're obviously all familiar with the COVID context, so we wanted to
maybe throw it back a little to some historic relevance.
Let's give it some context. In terms of public health policy, timely action, once you find out that this is a thing, the law's approach to personal freedom versus the greater good, government leaders' messaging and incorporating actual medical science.
How their rhetoric impacts society at large, responses to something like this, a huge epidemic, pandemic.
And just overall humanity of governmental and societal approaches.
It is a life or death thing, how governments respond to pandemics.
And so we wanted to frame this with the last large-scale national global epidemiological crisis, which was the outbreak of the AIDS epidemic.
Another example of the government ignoring a crisis early on, trying to kind of waffle in their response to it, and how that affected American citizens.
Yeah, consequent deaths from it. Certainly. I mean, it's a cautionary tale with a lot of similarities. We have like a TV movie star president, first of all, inaction from the executive, propaganda and bigoted moralizing over policy and medicine. Obviously, there are also big differences between the two epidemics. Largely, there are practical differences about the diseases themselves and treatment and science, which kind of highlights the fact that we have to inform the laws with science and medicine and keep ourselves informed.
Rooted in science, absolutely.
Yes.
Kenzie referenced earlier the differences in the pandemic that we are facing today versus the epidemic that we were facing in the 80s. One big thing I wanted to talk about is even though the two administrations, the Reagan administration in the 80s and the Trump administration now, even though both of their responses or lack of responses have been political, in the 80s there was an extra element which was obviously homophobia.
Right.
And the reason why the widespread deaths of these young men were ignored and why so little funding and research was put into it and people refused to acknowledge it for so long was bigotry. And I think that's really important to acknowledge before we start this conversation.
Yeah, and I think that you see how a lot of these things, even though COVID affects everybody, in Arizona, for example, you saw that on the reservation because they were
Absolutely.
A marginalized group with less funding and less attention and just less caring going towards them, that was where you saw the first outbreaks.
Allocation of resources is political at its core, and it does
and
indicate
it always comes
who
home
is
to
cared
roost.
for.
Yeah,
absolutely. And as we will discuss later in the episode, it, as Mackenzie just said, it has come home to roost. It comes back to bite us if we ignore problems out of ignorance and bigotry, whether it's toward a marginalized group of people such as Indigenous people or gay people, anyone in the LGBT community. It is going to blow up.
Even if you lack humanity, it'll get you.
We're all connected, and the reason why we take care of the most vulnerable is because we are stronger when we take care of the most vulnerable. That's one of the many
That's how you
reasons.
judge a society, right? How it treats its old people and children.
That's right.
Ay. Well, even though HIV is no longer a death sentence, and it's certainly not guaranteed to turn into AIDS, and we know a lot more about transmission and how to prevent it, that was not the case in the early 1980s. So my family, the Joy family, was the quintessential big conservative Catholic family. They lived in New York. They actively campaigned for Ronald Reagan, among others. My mom was the youngest of 7 kids. Her youngest older brother was 2 years older than her, and that was Stuart. The family was thrust into the center of the HIV/AIDS crisis.
It literally brought the issue home.
Yes, it did. So,
Stuart Alexander Joy was a visual artist and creative who was born in Brooklyn in 1958. He was driven and vivacious. He graduated Duke University and designed for Liz Claiborne. He palled around with Debbie Harry at Studio 54 in New York City. There was one story of Mackenzie's mom and aunt driving into the city when they saw a man attracting a crowd in Washington Square Park, and it wasn't until they got closer that they realized that it was their brother Stuart. He was the life of the party. He was always attracting people to him. In 1986, a year before Ronald Reagan even spoke the word AIDS publicly, Stuart was diagnosed with a virus that would kill him 2 years later at the age of 30. Toward the end, Stuart told his family that he was sad he wouldn't get to see how it all turned out. He was one of the many lives lost to AIDS in the early years of the AIDS crisis, when the government and society at large refused to acknowledge the reality of the widespread epidemic.
So we got a chance to meet for the first time via Zoom and discuss this with somebody who lived it. So without further ado, here is our interview with John Asher.
Look, I think because I was in the arts, I kind of believe in like letting it just play and roll and play out. No limitations as far as creativity. I think if you start off with limitations initially, the rose doesn't get to bloom fully.
I like that. Okay. I'm going to let you introduce who you are to me and who Stuart is, because I feel like that's more interesting than me doing it. So
Sure. Okay. Hi, Mackenzie, and hi, Brooke. It's a pleasure to have this conversation with you guys. So we're seeing each other through Skype, which is sort of nice because I've never really officially met you, Mackenzie, although I'm in a bizarre, distant way related, that's in air quotes, to you. I know your mom and your mom's family, the Joy family, from back in the early 1980s when I met your uncle, Stuart. We were both working at a department store in the name of Abraham and Strauss. It was named, it was called Abraham and Strauss. And it's no longer in existence, but it was a great store at that point in time. And I was still in college, and your uncle had just graduated from Duke University, and he was in the retail management training program. So I would see him throughout the store walking around or, you know, walking past the department, and I would say, oh, he's a cute guy. And eventually we just started having conversation, and we both decided, yeah, let's go out and have a drink or just go out for a social outing, which we did. And one thing led to another, and suddenly I had a boyfriend, and I was involved with Stuart Alexander Joy. So that goes back to like 1981 when it had all kind of started.
Okay.
Then by 1983, we decided to move in together. And he was living at home with his parents, your family.
Yeah.
And I was still living at home. I'm a few years younger than Stuart. So in 1983, we got our first apartment on the corner. It was on 435 East 76th Street. Small, one bedroom, but charming. And I remember, you know, acquiring certain things before we moved in together. We found some, you know, chairs in thrift shops, and we decided to reupholster them. And
he did a lot of that reupholstering and whatnot, right? Because I know he did my mom's furniture, surprised them when they came home from college.
Yep, that's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is true. And then after the lease was up in 1984, we moved into a larger apartment, which was 345 East 80th Street, apartment 4K. And it was a rent stabilized apartment, really big apartment.
My gosh.
Super low rent. And
it's a gold mine in New York.
Yeah, which is really hard to find in New York. I don't know if those deals exist anymore, but we had one. We had a really great suite apartment. And again, we fixed that place up, and you know, we're living as a gay couple in New York. So the scene in the 1980s, just to bring you back, because you guys weren't born yet.
No.
So New York was, look, there have always been and there will always be gay people. So that's since the beginning of time and will be till the end of time. But you know, it's always been kind of a taboo subject, and it's been kind of hush-hush, and that's where the term in the closet comes from, because you couldn't live an open, free life. And society wasn't willing to embrace that. And even families, you know, it was a scandal. So even though some families might have suspected or deep down inside known, it maybe just wasn't spoken about because people just didn't come out.
Well, I meant to ask, when you and Stuart moved in together, how did you couch that to your respective families? Because I know my family was very conservative. They were Catholic. My grandfather was the head of the Conservative Party on Long Island at one point. So obviously good people, I love them. But
I think certainly until the end of Stuart's life, they didn't fully acknowledge it, as far as I know. So
Yes.
I'd be interested to know what your experience was. And I understand that you came from a conservative family yourself.
I came from a conservative family as well, a Republican family, conservative points of view, also Catholic. In fact,
Yes.
The joke was your grandmother would always say, why aren't any of these girls, anyone bring home a nice Catholic boy? So
Stuart did. Like, he was the only one.
Of all things.
Yeah.
So there you go. There was a nice Catholic boy brought into the family.
You're welcome,
Unfortunately,
Joy family.
He was a nice Catholic gay boy.
Yeah.
There's a little curveball in there. Lindsay married a Jewish guy, and your dad, I believe, was...
He was a liberal atheist, so...
Liberal atheist. So, I mean, everyone was kind of all over the board.
Yeah.
But, so someone brought home a Catholic boy. Unfortunately,
Stuart did well, yes.
Stuart. So, yes, everyone was kind of conservative. And so when we decided to move in, we always spoke in terms of roommates.
Yes.
Stuart was my roommate.
Thought that for a long time. I think my aunt believed what Stuart had told her, which is that it was a one-bedroom, but that you rotated who slept on the couch month to month. Come on. Really? But I guess you believe what you want to believe.
Absolutely. This is true. And so, it's funny that you say that. People say if you don't acknowledge the truth, it isn't true. But
Yeah.
Right.
So that will bring us to a conversation down the road with our current administration. But anyway, so we did move in together. And back in the early 1980s, there was what was deemed the gay plague. That was sort of, you would hear about and read about and hear about this up and coming disease. And initially, it was a disease that had only affected homosexuals, hemophiliacs, supposedly horses, and Haitians. So that's early. That's
so
really
specific. It's very strange.
It is very specific and very strange. But I don't know how Haitians and horses got thrown in there. But now it makes sense about hemophiliacs and homosexuals in the sense that it's something that could have been transmitted through blood.
Sure.
But it was a disease that was affecting a certain part of society and a certain people that not too many people paid attention to. Going back to we don't have gay people in our family, or no one's gay here, or they're mentally sick anyway, so they shouldn't, because again, homosexuality was thought of as an illness at that point in time, and earlier. It was almost against the law, I think, at one point.
It was certainly in
yes.
The cases that struck down those laws are late 90s in a Supreme Court setting. So New York usually is the most progressive. If it wasn't happening here, those protections, it wasn't happening anywhere. So there was a Texas law I know that was addressed in a case that it outlawed sodomy, and it was only enforced, of course, against gay men. But that was struck down, I think, in the 90s. So it was against the law in some places.
Wow.
Yeah.
So again, it was because it was affecting only a certain segment, what was deemed as maybe an undesirable or an unimportant group of people that, people didn't pay too much attention to. But the CDC was aware of this and what was transpiring and going on. They're smart, educated people.
As they still are.
Yes. And they're aware of what's going on and what's out there. So it was brought up to the Reagan administration because that's kind of when it's sort of going into full effect, really starting to spread and become rampant. And it was, something that was in, metro areas like Manhattan, New York, and San Francisco, and, larger cities that had large groups of the gay population. But I don't know whether I should go into my own personal part of this now.
Maybe Brooke, because Brooke actually did some research on the early days, and I think that actually might segue well into the years that certain things happened with Stewart.
Yeah, so I believe what you were talking about with the Reagan administration being approached with the issue, there was a press conference in '82 where a reporter was talking to Larry Speakes, who was the press secretary at the time.
Yes.
He brought it up and it was laughed at.
President have any reaction now from the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta that AID has is now an epidemic, over 600 cases. It's known as gay plague. No, it is. I mean, it's a pretty serious thing. It's one in every 3 people that get this have died, and I wonder if the president is aware of it. I don't have it. Are you? Do you? You don't have it. Well, I'm relieved to hear that. Do you? You don't. You didn't answer my question. How do you know? Does the president, in other words, the White House looked on this as a great joke? No, I don't know anything about it, man.
Then it was brought up again in '84, '85. And of course, by that time, there had been thousands of deaths. I think like 5,000, over 5,000 deaths. And when it was brought up again, they were making jokes about it and getting really defensive.
The disease control is less. The president is concerned about this subject, Larry, that has concern reaction here. It isn't always a shock. Look, is he going to do anything, Larry? I've not heard him express anything. He has expressed no opinion about this epidemic. No, but I must confess I have asked him about it. Would you ask him, Larry? Go back into the phone.
And that was in, I believe, '84. This is after thousands of people, many more cases, but thousands of people had already died. And it was a joke within the press pool.
Even caring about
House.
it was a joke. It was also, if you think about how many folks knew, and this can kind of transition us to your experience with it, that I was speaking to my mom last night about it to just get a little bit of familial context. And she was working as a young nurse at the time. She's your age. And she self-described and recovering, very strong conservative Catholic at the time too. And she said, the difference is that I never felt hate for my brother, but there was a grain in my mind of why can't you just be different? Just stop and it'll go away. And they were starting to notice things around '85. And my grandmother and grandfather had told my mom, who was working out in Arizona in healthcare, to avoid that population more out of fear because they didn't want her to get sick. And I can't imagine that there wasn't a political undertone to it, but there certainly was a nationwide awareness that she's working in healthcare in Arizona. The New York family's telling her to be careful.
Yeah, and it's
certainly known.
when the rhetoric from the top, when the messaging from the top, which was the White House, is that this is not something to be concerned about, and if anything, there was an element of disdain, and there's the homophobic jokes
and otherism
being made. Otherism,
it's them. It's not.
And if you care about this, if you're bringing it up, then you're going to be shamed.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to ask you about around that time, what was in your experience, the community's feelings around that kind of rhetoric coming from the Oval Office?
Sure. You're absolutely correct in terms of the press conference. And when it was brought to the attention, when it was brought up in a press conference and asked about whether President Reagan was aware, or if he had, or was in tune with what was going on, this disease that was affecting a certain population in the United States. He was sort of laughed at and snickered and put back on the reporter who had asked the question. It was kind of like it was taboo and like you were bad, dirty, or it might implicate that you might be gay. And that they laughed at it, snickered at it, and moved on to the next subject. So, and it was again brought up again, I'm sure many times, but it was again because it was affecting a certain audience that just somehow didn't matter or register, and it wasn't deemed as, and that's inexcusable, but kind of indicative of the times, in terms of affecting a group that somehow didn't matter, and no one was out or stating that they were out, so it was kind of all hush hush. And if you wound up having it, it was almost like this negative stigma, and you were, you know, almost like an outcast of society at that point in time. Unlike today's administration, where COVID is affecting any and everyone, which is, you know, and still being downplayed, ignored, and deemed as nothing that's life-threatening, where it is. And in actuality, when you think back into the 1980s and the beginning of AIDS, because it did start within the gay community, but eventually could be spread to any and everyone.
The
wasn't
foresight is remarkable. Like, how do you?
Yeah. So if you really think about it, it's like how one person affects another person, or it passes to one person, that goes on to 2 people, to 4, to 8, and it just keeps multiplying and becoming larger and larger, just like COVID does, you know, and large groups of people. I mean, obviously, the way it's transmitted is very different, but so I'll get back to my portion. Did I answer the question, Brooke, as far as?
Oh yeah. Did the community register at all that they were kind of being left behind in all this and ignored?
Yes. I mean, when, of course, anything that would affect your own community, you take a greater interest in. And so there was a discussion amongst the gay community, like, there's this disease that's going out there, and, you know, it's killing people, and it cripples your immune system, and it's passed on sexually. And, you know, if you think about society in general, when you say someone was in the closet, because society didn't embrace gays, there was really no place for a gay man to go out and meet another gay man. So you would either meet them in a gay bar, or, you know, walking on the street, deemed as cruising, you know, where you would pass each other and look, you know, check each other out. And because people were so closeted, there was really nowhere to go. You couldn't go to a bar and speak intimately. I mean, of course you could, but, you know, it's not like going out on a date would be the same as for an accepted heterosexual couple. And so there were all kinds of crazy sex clubs and back rooms and bars where you could go and be intimate with someone, because, you know, if you were living at home, you couldn't bring them home to your mother and father. Oh, hi, this is my boyfriend, because it was a time when it just wasn't socially accepted.
It's funny, I never put together that kind of arose out of necessity.
Right, that it was, you didn't even have safe spaces, so you had to create your own safe spaces to meet each other.
By themselves kind of became concentrated, and for this kind of thing, that could be the worst thing, but how do you know that's going to happen?
They were born of necessity.
Right. I didn't
Absolutely. And so it, you know, it's almost like all aspects of society weren't acknowledging it, so the administration wasn't going to acknowledge it. And it's kind of worked hand in hand. Yeah. And it's wrong, obviously, and was not effective because it kind of exploded. Compared to today's pandemic, when, you know, it affects everyone. You can just be walking in a grocery store and someone might sneeze, and next thing you know, poof, you've got the coronavirus. So there are parallels, but there are obvious differences.
I think it's such a good example of how dangerous shame and stigma and an anti-science view of something can be.
That's the through line.
Because it really marginalizes people who are suffering when if you can't, you know, again, like you said, there wasn't a lot of concern in this society at large. And so the administration reflected that, but that caused it to blow up because there was a stigma around it. And
I think Reagan really paved the way for this administration to be allowed to do that weird moralistic politicizing of, I mean,
very anti-science.
Yes. And that's why the message from the top is an important one. Because even smart, educated people hear what they want to hear, or hear certain things that come from the most important person in the world. I'll deem him as that. I certainly don't think Donald Trump is the most important person in the world. Unfortunately, he has that.
He's sitting in that chair right now.
He's sitting in that chair, and I don't think he's really up for the job. He's had
I'd say the same of Reagan at the time. Another Hollywood person who kind of
former over policy guy.
It was a propaganda campaign more than anything else. So
yes, and it's dangerous.
Just to move it back to your personal experience with it, I guess we can talk about when Stewart was diagnosed.
Sure, and if we're talking about the 84 press conference, I think
that's a good off point.
Yeah, that's certainly when my Aunt Allie was married in 85, and my family said that Stewart was different to their eyes.
Yes, so your uncle was fashion designer, handbags and belts. I was shoe designer. So in 1984, when we moved into our second apartment, Stewart was working with Liz Claiborne.
Actually wearing that now.
Oh, for crying out loud.
Yeah.
He was working for Liz Claiborne and traveling the world and in a job that he loved. But, in 1984, he started saying how he was tired a lot of the time, exhausted. And, we thought nothing of it because we never thought that was at our threshold. Right. And we deemed it as, well, he travels the world. He's got jet lag, always working really late hours. Stewart had a bit of a wild side in him, though. So when he would go out, he would really go out and have a great time and sometimes not come home. And so there were a few nights where I was like, oh, I'm working a little bit late. I was like, okay, don't worry, I have dinner ready, blah, blah, blah. And so I would wait till like 8, 9, 10, 11, and then call the office and say like, and wonder if he was coming home. And there were no cell phones, didn't exist back then. Right. So you couldn't check in. And so his phone would ring, and his office phone, and I never answered. And so I was like, I guess he went out or whatever. And, and then next morning would come and might show up. But, there were times where he didn't come home for a couple of days. So, and
was
so
that stressful
kind of
for you? I mean,
extremely stressful and disappointing because, there was one New Year's Eve where I'd prepared a really big dinner and again, just never came home. And then I got a phone call on New Year's Day. I think it was like 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the morning. And, he was really out of it. He didn't know where he was and called me from a payphone because that's how you communicated with people.
Right.
And I said, just stay there. And I jumped in the car and went down and picked him up and got him home. So we... just never putting, sometimes where there's smoke, there's fire, but you never put I never put the pieces of the puzzle together.
Sure.
We're being a little bit wild and being out and not coming home certain times. And then when he was working, when he was home, how he was not feeling well and tired. And this went on for a few years until 1986 when he started getting fevers and very, very bad night sweats and something just clearly wasn't right.
Right.
So I remember his temperature was so sky high. I got him in a cold bath, tried to get his body temperature down, and we went to the emergency room. And that's when I guess he spoke. I mean, I wasn't allowed in because I wasn't deemed family. So he was in with the doctor, and I guess they, did some tests and, through conversation, not that you would get immediate results, but they were indicating that was indeed the case. And then I remember him coming home saying that he was HIV positive. And I was really just, I felt like the rug was pulled out from underneath my feet. It's sort of like when someone is so ill and they're around, they keep holding on. And then eventually when that eventually something's going to happen. But even when it happens, it's still kind of devastating.
Of course.
So you weren't surprised per se, but it was
It was
assaulting kind of.
yes, yeah. It was really, and of course, very concerned for Stuart. But then I was also very concerned for myself because
Yes.
I was, kind of a victim of circumstance.
Yeah.
So that was brought into our household. And as I said earlier, if you were deemed as HIV positive, at that point in time, there were no cures, there were no real drugs. It was still so new that it was like, okay, you got this. And usually you start the clock in 2 years or less is what your life sentence becomes.
Yeah.
Even at that point, so if 86, the administration had been aware, I believe, since 83, and
Yes.
so little money or resources were allocated toward treatment or research. So, of course, there wasn't, a cure or treatment because nothing had been done about it for 3 years.
That is very true, Brooke. Yes. And so was a very scary position to be in. And I was 24, 25, 26 years old, starting working and, not really having a lot of money between us and, just being young when we should be thinking about like what vacations we're going to be going on and what parties we're going to be going to and where we're going out on Friday night or for the weekend and what friends we're going to see. It automatically shifted like, oh my God, what are we going to do?
I'm so sorry. What month did he get diagnosed? I'm just trying to think about when.
I think it was.
Suspicions arose in a more.
I don't know whether it was like August or September of 1986, I think.
So I only ask because I know that my mom had told us about a conversation that she had with him out in Arizona, and it was before a formal diagnosis. And he said, I think I have this rash in my mouth, and it was oral thrush, and it was so obviously oral thrush to her, which, for anybody who doesn't know, is a fungal infection that was a real marker at the time of HIV specifically because it preys on a weak immune system. And you don't really see young people getting that.
That is correct. Yes.
My mom said that looking at, because she was a nurse, she was looking in his mouth and she knew in that moment that he was probably going to die. And she told him, I love you. You can tell me whatever you want. Go talk to Dad.
Because your grandpa was a physician at the time, right?
And he was conservative, obviously, but she thought, I don't think Dad will turn him away, but he'll know what to do. But Stuart didn't tell her anything specific. I don't think he came out expressly at the time. But certainly.
He did not. Again, the fear.
Yeah,
of course.
And the stigma.
Yeah.
And also at that point in time, as people were being diagnosed with this, you would read about how or hear about how families were rejecting their own sons. Yeah. And so then not only were they ill, they had no family support, nowhere to go. And it was a really difficult judgment that was really like, oh my God, like talk about your world, your life and your world and everything crumbling.
And when you need it most, you need family or money or support or something.
Absolutely. And there was no cure. So it wasn't like, okay, well, if I go to the doctor and I take this, I'll get better. Or if I have this procedure, they'll remove it and I've got a chance. It was like, there was no chance really. So Stuart eventually did speak to his parents. After he had shared with me, I was like, and I know he was fearful to talk to his dad about it, your grandfather. But he did. And he was sick at that point in time. And I think he had to go to the hospital where your grandfather was working, which was Nassau County Medical Center, I believe.
Okay.
And he was admitted and they did some tests. And I remember speaking to your grandfather, Dr. Joy, and, I know that Stu was experiencing something that was, because it attacked all aspects of your immune system. And so he was having pain where anything, like even to lay a sheet on top of him was excruciatingly painful. So I remember your grandfather saying he couldn't even put a sheet on him, even though he was shivering and then sweating from fever and chills.
Yeah.
But they somehow got him the symptoms under control for the time being. But that was just a temporary fix.
Yeah.
And as the disease progressed, your immune system continues to break down and you become more susceptible. There was something called PCP, pneumocystic pneumonia, which it floats in the air. Like you and I we're all breathing it at the here and now. But when you have a healthy immune system, you're not susceptible to it. So, that was always very dangerous for anyone who was HIV positive. And there was also physical markings that would appear on your body called Kaposi's sarcoma. And you would get large red blotches. So on top of physically deteriorating, like you just lost all kind of muscle tone and you would lose weight. And so, many times AIDS victims look like, skeleton with skin just draped on them. You would also have these bright purple, red markings on you. And so you truly became like outcasts in society.
Like branded. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Like Hester Prynne in The Scarlet Letter. Stuart never had any of the marks, the Kaposi's sarcoma, but he did have pneumocystic pneumonia twice. And again, through meds and antibiotics, somehow came out of both of those, but was, even though he would survive that episode, was still deteriorating in other ways. And I remember being at your grandparents' house with Stuart one time, and we were watching some television. I had just come over to visit, and we were talking, and all of a sudden he had a seizure, a very bad seizure. And I remember him just falling and seeing his body flailing on the ground. And I ran down the steps and got your grandfather and grandmother. Very scary, very frightening.
What did they do?
Your grandfather got it under control, and then we knew that he had to go to the hospital or be further checked. And I remember him, because he was sitting on the edge of the bed, and then when he started having the convulsion, fell over and scraped his head and was bleeding a little bit. And that is very, you couldn't be around blood because, you could be.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
And, it was just all around scary. And again, we're like young guys in our 20s, our 20s. You shouldn't be dealing with this kind of thing. Right. But somehow we were living it. It became our life,
Yeah. How did the family handle it? Did they allow you to come over freely? I know obviously both of my grandparents retired to take care of Stuart, but they also, my grandmother's still conservative to this day. I think my grandfather was until he died. So it was kind of a cognitive dissonance that I know went further than a lot of parents did. It's just interesting, both of you being good Catholic boys. How was that?
Well, it's interesting, again, going back to Catholics, where the Catholic Church at that point in time also had deemed homosexuals as intrinsic moral evils. And
nicely put.
So it's like, okay, yeah.
So you can't even find comfort if you are a person of faith and you were raised, in the church, which I had a religious background as well. And I know that for some people, even if you aren't a part of the church anymore, a practicing member, it's still something that you could potentially find comfort in. And now you're even being rejected and demonized by this place that you could have otherwise potentially found comfort.
It's what turned my mom away from the church. After he died,
Yeah, absolutely. And so I wasn't present for the conversations that Stuart had with his parents. But your grandparents rose to the occasion. I don't know what they said when they were in bed together, speaking about the situation, but they did rise to the occasion. And your grandfather expressed great concern for my health and well-being.
Okay.
And that was very kind. And he had said, obviously, I have to go start being tested on a regular basis because you just don't know.
Yeah.
And he checked me out several times as far as one indication was the thrush, which I never had, swollen lymph nodes in either your neck or under your arms or in your groinal area, extreme swollen lymph nodes. And your grandfather would check me out on a semi-regular basis. And I started going to my own doctor, who was a gay doctor.
Oh, that's great.
Living in New York, I would ask friends, like I didn't have a physician, I had a family physician, but it wasn't certainly a conversation I was comfortable having with the same physician that my parents and brothers and sisters would go to. So I had my own physician in New York, and I was tested on a regular basis, on a yearly basis for, supposedly the virus can was able to live inside of you for up to 20 years without showing symptom. Yeah.
Interesting.
So from, my mid-20s until almost my 50s,
relatively recent.
Yeah. I mean, about 10 years ago, would always be fearful. And, as time went on, the doctors say, no, that's because it's,
You're
more
doing
was
okay
learned
for this
about,
long.
Yes. Yeah. And I've been okay for that long, but, but even so, every time I would go for a blood test, just always living in fear was a bit of torment. Yeah. But getting back to Stuart, Stuart had become debilitated beyond being able to come back to the apartment because I just couldn't, I couldn't handle it anymore.
Of course.
Fair enough.
I didn't, again, in my 20s, I just didn't know if or when something might happen. And, you come from a family of doctors and nurses, everyone in your family.
They were uniquely equipped to deal with that. And God bless it. When you're talking about my grandfather checking you out, it's good that he did, but this is a man who also at dinner parties, my aunt would bring a boyfriend home, trying to make a good impression. And my grandfather would be like, so Allie, how are your bowels? Okay, good. So he's
very, very
a very open man.
When we had
a little intrusive.
It was dinner conversation because everyone was a medical professional. So speaking about bodily fluids or bodily functions or a disease.
I'll tell you that persists to this day, for better or worse.
Was actually, I guess commonplace where it's something that in my house, we didn't ever speak of that even. But yes, your grandfather really showed his kind and professional side to me out of concern because he did recognize that I was kind of a victim of circumstance there.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And, but as I was saying, Stuart was debilitating more and more. Yeah. And it was really necessary for him to be where someone was present all the time.
Yeah.
And a medical professional, doctor or nurse was always.
We were lucky in that sense. Yeah, certainly.
So he got sick one more time, and that was in the summer in July. And this is 1988. And he was admitted to the hospital, and it was Cabrini Medical Center. Which was in Lower Manhattan. And that was the hospital that his AIDS doctor, because he had a doctor that was specifically involved with HIV research. And he was admitted to that hospital and got worse and worse. And I don't remember who called me to tell me that there's a term in medical speak, code blue. And I think that's coronary arrest.
Okay.
You have to either be resuscitated or not. And they resuscitated Stuart.
Mm-hmm.
He was put on life support at that point with breathing tube. And I remember at that point in time, we just sort of knew the end was coming.
Yeah.
And your grandmother would go every single day to visit Stuart. And I would meet her during the day for a couple of hours or in the evening. And I remember because Stuart died August 1988.
And Lindsay got married a couple days before. He was supposed to go to the wedding.
Yes.
And he had that decline, right?
Yes. In fact, I was with him that whole day that Lindsay got married. And he was most concerned because he was like, he wasn't able to shower, and his hair, he's like a mess. And so I remember washing his hair for him.
Oh.
Because that was really important to him. So I don't remember when he had the coronary arrest, but we knew that the end was coming. And I would just remember how distraught your grandmother was.
God, yeah.
And how, he was on life support, and how your grandmother kept saying, like, I don't care. He can stay this way. I'll take care of him this way.
I know that she offered to just bring him home and keep him in the attic like that. Just keep him.
I can't imagine. No, you're totally
it's
fine.
okay.
Of course, I can't imagine. It was just such a cruel disease.
Yeah.
I think that it's happened so quickly. Like you said, as soon as someone was diagnosed, they knew that they were
starts.
on bar.
Yeah.
They had a limited amount of time left, and you don't even get good time because. It just ravages your body, and it's just such a difficult being a loved one of that person. I can't imagine what it was like.
You especially, John.
Absolutely.
I think everybody was in their own head, and in retrospect, my mom has said, I wish I had the wherewithal to know what you were going through, because she was just
and at that point in time, it's not even like you could say like, oh, hi, I'm Stuart's partner, and I could hear test results or ask for information about his current condition, because I wasn't family, so I never really knew, other than what was, and your grandparents and your sisters, your mom and your aunts I was always aware. But it's not like I could ever ask or find out. Because,
but that's as good as it got,
who's
kind of.
Who's calling?
Yeah,
well, this is his partner. Like, well, you're not family. We can't reveal any information to you. So it was, I swear, I remember being in the apartment alone when he was in the hospital, and like lighting a candle and keeping that burning for him, because I wasn't sure if he was I'd be able to sleep with him or see him the next day. And
what a strange thing.
It was, but after he was in almost a coma and just on life support, we all knew it was no way out. You were just down a dead end street with a brick wall in front of you, nowhere to turn.
You don't come back.
Nowhere.
It doesn't.
No. It was really the end. I remember back then there were things called Sony Walkman.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And I remember putting music on and putting it on Stuart's head, because he loved Blondie and he loved the Talking Heads. And,
all great bands,
yeah. So I remember putting music on, putting earphones on him, and, whether he heard it or not, obviously, but I thought he would.
Yeah.
Just so that it was something that he related to and happy. I did that night, and we all were in that room. We all stayed. He was in a private room. We all were in that room the night that he passed.
Yeah, Mom said you, her, and my grandparents were there.
Yes, we were there. And we all took turns, and your grandfather nodding off, and your grandmother occasionally. It was close to like 4 3 or 4 in the morning when he passed. And I just... Sorry.
It's
Take
okay.
your time.
Yeah.
I remember walking out just like in such disbelief, because even though, like I was saying earlier, even though you know that, I just could not believe it. And I remember your grandparents and your mom driving me uptown, dropping me off at the apartment. They asked, did I want them to come upstairs with me? Because it was the first time I was going to go into the apartment.
Yeah.
And I said, no. And I knew that your grandmother, that everyone had more or less been up almost all night long.
Mm.
And I just remember going upstairs in such disbelief and breaking down.
God, I can't imagine. Alone.
But then I was like, oh my God, I have to start to tell people the next steps. When you're Catholic, you know, there's going to be a wake and there's going to be a funeral. And what am I going to say to everybody? And I hadn't really shared the truth with my family that Stuart was HIV. I'd said he had leukemia. You know, I had to come up with a quick one.
No, it's easier.
Because at one point in time, my dad was also dying at the exact same time. And my dad died
Oh my God.
August, 3 months after Stuart.
Oh.
And my dad needed blood. And he couldn't accept everyone's blood, and I had his type. So I was asked to donate I was expected to donate blood, and I had to come and say, I can't donate blood because... Well, why? Why can't you? And, you know, it was just all around the lying and the
What did you say?
hiding. I said there was a possibility I was exposed, or, you know, I was in contact with something.
Okay.
But, you know, but I couldn't donate blood because I wasn't even allowed to donate blood, even if I couldn't say, like, yeah, of course I would have given my father blood. He needed it. So, you know, coming home at that point in time saying, well, what am I going to tell my parents? Oh, Stuart had died. And what am I going to tell my friends? And, you know, and my close friends, like Edward was our friend.
Right,
Edward
yeah, of course. Because the family knew him as well, yeah.
Yes. So I had a few close friends to say what had transpired. But other than that, I didn't know how to really share with anyone and to say, like, oh, well, in the living in fear, like, oh my God, if my mother and my family go, because they knew Stuart, he was in our home so many times, and they knew him, say, like, oh my God, if my mother, my sister, my brothers go to the wake and they find out like he was HIV and, you know, just again,
you're
living
stuck
in secrecy and fear and, you know, and not sharing the full truth out of fear.
So you go through all this trauma and you lose someone who's deeply important to you, and then you don't even get the support system. You don't even get the ability to tell, you know, the people around you, your acquaintances, your employers, or whatever it is. Like you don't get the what would be expected in other situations of that acknowledgement of your loss.
Yes, absolutely. That is true. So it's like, it's just insult to injury.
Right. Over and over.
Really over and over. Now, getting back to the Reagan administration, when the Reagan administration was starting to acknowledge the presence of AIDS, it was because Ronald Reagan was a former Hollywood actor, when, you know, because it was becoming more and more in the public eye about HIV. Liberace, who was